All right, welcome back to week 2 lecture notes on the transformation of the West and the new segregated South. In part 2, we're going to look at how the liberties of blacks after 1877 gave way to legal segregation across the South. So the group of merchants, planters, and businessmen who dominated the South's politics after 1877 called themselves redeemers because they claimed to have redeemed the region from the alleged horrors of Black Reconstruction. After they came to power, they worked to undo as much of Reconstruction's gains as they possibly could. New laws were passed that allowed pretty much any person who is unemployed to be arrested, and it also greatly increased the penalties for petty crimes. Not surprisingly, the South's prison population rose, and renting out convicts became a really profitable business. Every southern state allowed for this new type of labor that was called the conflict lease system, where convicted criminals would be leased out to private businessmen. The conditions in the labor camps in which these criminals were put in were often pretty barbaric and often had really high disease and death rates. And unfortunately, while some of these industrialists prospered, the region as a whole pretty much stalled economically. Some industry did develop, so you do have pockets of mining in the Appalachian Mountains. You have textile production in the Carolinas, cigarette manufacturing in certain cities, especially in Virginia. But businesses were more interested in the cheap convict labor in the South rather than overall regional economic development. And as the most disadvantaged group, Black farmers often suffered the most. Some economic opportunities were available in the Upper South for African Americans, like mining and tobacco factories, some even able to acquire land. But most of the great plantations of the Deep South had fallen apart, and some blacks on that land became self-sufficient farmers. But in most of the Deep South, blacks owned a smaller percentage of land in 1900 than they had at the end of Reconstruction. In southern cities, though, the networks of institutions that were created after the Civil War, things like schools and churches and clubs, really served as a foundation for a diverse Black urban community to prosper, where many were able to enter the middle class and work in professions like teachers, doctors, or businessmen. But the labor market continued to be divided on racial lines, and often blacks were excluded from supervisory or white-collar positions. Women were often relegated to work as servants entirely, and black men and women, I should say, were often excluded from union membership. So thinking of themselves as trapped at the bottom, some blacks tried to emigrate from the South. And we see one particular instance in 1879 and 1880 where 40 to 60,000 African Americans migrated to Kansas, where they looked for better opportunities, calling it an exodus, derived from the biblical account of the Jews escaping slavery in Egypt. But because they lacked the money to become farmers, most ended up as unskilled laborers in towns and cities. But few chose to return to the South. Most African Americans, though, had little opportunity but to stay in the South. So neither black voting nor black office holding came to an abrupt end in 1877. Blacks continued to vote in large numbers in some areas, even into the 1890s, even though Democrats took control of politics by redrawing district lines and consolidating control of local politics. Political opportunities became more and more restricted. Business, law, and the church increasingly offered greater opportunities for advancement and community service than politics. Political leadership was more and more often held by black women activists. You see in some groups, like the National Association of Colored Women, formed in 1896, that brought together women's clubs to press for women's rights and racial uplift. These women reformers challenged the racial ideologies that held that all blacks were second-class citizens. Between 1890 and 1906, though, every Southern state enacted laws that were aimed at eliminating the black vote, despite the 15th Amendment that ensured their ability to vote. Legislatures got around the 15th Amendment by passing laws that looked to be colorblind. The most popular methods were the poll tax, which was a fee that a person had to pay before they were allowed to vote, and literacy tests. 6 Southern states also adopted a grandfather clause that stated that only people who had a descendant able to vote prior to the Civil War had the ability to vote, which was clearly a time when only whites could vote in the South. This one was so obvious that the Supreme Court invalidated grandfather clauses in 1915, but the other methods of limiting the black vote remained. White leaders often presented these laws as a way of purifying politics by ending the fraud, violence, and manipulation of voting returns that were supposedly common during the Reconstruction period. Even though whites were often allowed to bypass the new voting laws, poor and illiterate whites also lost the right to vote based on some of these new laws. The 1890s also saw the widespread implementation of segregation in the South. There were many precedents for such laws. Even many areas of the pre-Civil War North were segregated. But Southern schools and other institutions were segregated during Reconstruction even. In 1893, in the civil rights cases, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed segregation of public facilities. And what the court determined here was that the 14th Amendment prohibited unequal treatment by state authorities, not private businesses. And again, in 1896, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson declared that it was constitutional for states to require separate facilities for whites and blacks. This case allowed for Southern states to pass laws that mandated racial segregation in every aspect of Southern life, from schools to hospitals, waiting rooms, toilets, even cemeteries. And even though an important aspect of the Plessy decision was that facilities could be separate but had to remain equal, facilities for blacks in the South were either non-existent or substantially inferior. But more than just racial separation, segregation in the South was part of a system of white domination in the South. The point was to ensure that when blacks and whites came into contact with one another, that whites continuously held the upper hand. Segregation impacted other groups as well. In some parts of Mississippi, where Chinese laborers were brought in to work in the fields after the Civil War, 3 separate school systems were established. In California, Black, Hispanic, and Native American children were frequently educated alongside whites, but state laws required separate schools for those of Chinese descent. And in Texas and California, even though Mexicans were considered legally white, they found themselves barred from many restaurants, places of entertainment, and lots of other public facilities. For blacks that hoped to challenge the system or refused to accept their status, often faced the threat of violence. And every year, between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 people, the vast majority of those 50 black men, were lynched in the South, which means that they were murdered by a mob, usually by public hanging. Lynching continued well into the 20th century. Some lynchings occurred secretly at night, but others were advertised in advance and attracted large crowds of onlookers. Many lynchings of black men occurred after an accusation of raping a white woman, and many Southerners considered preserving the purity of white womanhood a justification for their vengeance. Yet, in nearly all of the cases where that accusation was made, as Ida B. Wells argued in her newspaper editorial, that the charge of rape was often a lie. Historians interested in the topic have often corroborated Wells's claims. Her essay also condemned the lynching of 3 black men in Memphis, and her article led a mob to destroy her newspaper while she was out of the city. She ended up moving to the North and became the nation's leading anti-lynching crusader. As the North and South became more intertwined following the Civil War, the ideas of racial equality that were born out of the war were increasingly abandoned. In popular literature, memoirs written by veterans, as well as at veterans reunions, and public memorials, the Civil War came to be remembered as a tragic family fight among white Americans, where blacks really held zero significance. Slavery was increasingly viewed as a minor issue, not the war's fundamental cause, and Reconstruction became known as a regrettable period where African Americans were unable to successfully participate in political life. This outlook gave legitimacy to Southern efforts to eliminate black voting. More and more Southern governments put up monuments to the lost cause of the Confederacy. School textbooks started to emphasize the roles of happy slaves and the evils of Reconstruction, and the role of black soldiers in winning the war was pretty much all but forgotten.